So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first edition of Hudson Talent Talk. It's where we're going to be bringing TA experts to talk about some of the challenges that we're having in the talent industry. Our first guest today is David Priestley. David Priestley is a dear friend, old client, and partner in crime, so to speak, as he's transformed many organizations and the landscape around talent. So David, welcome. Good morning, and would you mind introducing yourself to our viewers?
Thank you, Jake. It's good to be here for our fireside chat. It feels a bit strange to be around a fireside with you and not have an old fashioned in our hand, but I guess it's early. Um, uh, so yeah, thanks for the intro. TA, I guess, is what my entire career has been. Pretty much half of it to date was on the external side, and then the second half on the internal side. I've lived in Switzerland for the last 10 years, where I led until recently the global talent acquisition agenda for Lonza, which is manufacturing in the pharma and biotech space. And before that, I was in the oil and gas industry, leading TA for one of the oil and gas operators.
Yeah, Dave, thank you. And your expertise of helping save the world is not unnoticed, right? So for those viewers, Lonza was part of the response to COVID-19, and Lonza was manufacturing the Moderna drug. And so David had to build that team to help staff to meet those demands. So David, one of the
A
things
fun
we've
time indeed, but it was really down to the team that succeeded there, not me. But I
You are very
appreciate it.
modest, sir. You're very modest. But it's interesting because we've seen a heck of a transformation over the last couple of years, right? We've seen, macroeconomics, geopolitical issues face us. We've seen the Great Resignation, and most recently, we saw what we called the Great Hesitation, where companies weren't really investing, attrition was in single digits, everybody was in that hurry up and wait mode. So what is this next evolution? Where are you seeing or where are you hearing as you do conversations with many talented professionals and business leaders? What's happening in the talent space that we can expect here in the coming year?
Well, I guess what I'm certainly seeing and feeling is that the hesitation was kind of behind. Yeah, we're starting to see organizations coming out of it, albeit I think there's been a bit of a pause over the last few weeks with some of that geopolitical turmoil that is still upon us. Um, uh, but I think we are definitely going to come out. And whilst activity is going to be across the board, one of the interesting things that I read this week actually was the a recent Gartner survey. Um, uh, and that made me realize that actually some of the pain might be felt at the top of the house more. Um, uh, so what they were saying is that 56% of C-suite leaders plan to leave their current organization within the next 2 years. So they're defining C-suite leaders as those that are direct reports of the CEO. So that's more than half, right? That's more than half of our leadership teams in the next 2 years. But actually, when they drill down, 27% are reporting to be either likely or extremely likely to leave in the next 6 months.
And David, why? What do you think is driving that? That's a huge stat, and stats, that will really shake up not only the industries but also the organization as a whole when you have that key leadership, and it also brings into questions like succession planning and talent pipelining and all of that great stuff that we always talked about in TA. But what's the driver of that, or what do you think the driver of that might be?
So there's a number of things. There's well-being. There's pent-up frustration in the system. Um, uh, but you raise a really good point about OTR or the succession planning, right? So we call that inside, obviously, the OTR process. And this is the time of the general OTR process. So I think it'll be interesting to see which organizations are getting ready for this and are really looking at their bench strength and their successors. And if they don't have the right internal successors, are they getting ahead, in terms of talent scouting now? Because with that level of movement, if they're not, then I guess the executive search market is going to hot up pretty quickly.
We can't have that happen, right? We just that would not be good. But it's interesting that you say that because one of the things I'm seeing and I'm hearing, talent acquisition is more than just finding people, right? We hit on being stewards of succession planning and helping that process, being stewards of talent mapping and looking at what does that mean. I've had many conversations with leaders now about boomerang programs. So
Mhm.
boomerang programs for those listeners, these are individuals that have left your firm within the last 18 months to maybe 3 years, maybe even a little bit longer, that thought the grass might be greener at another company or another industry, but maybe realize that it's not. And so there's a rehireability and trying to go back and attract. And it's interesting you say that with this potential exodus of the C-suite. What does that mean and what programs do leaders need to put in or companies need to put in place for that? Not just at that C-suite, but also at that lower level or at that next level down. And I don't know, David, you've gone through this in your profession. What has been successful for you and in your organizations in that?
So actually, I think one thing that I designed and implemented a long time ago actually was a 2+2 succession planning model um, uh, where we were really looking at, for leaders to move forward, they should really be in charge of their succession plan for who will replace them. And we encourage leaders really to look at 2+2 as two external as well as two internal. Um, uh, and so the internal is the easier part to do, right? But to really support leaders at understanding where are the gaps, in terms of the people that are on their succession plan and what can they do to support filling the gaps.
Right.
But then how can they think about that with external as well? And so it may just be meeting with these people once or twice a year, being someone that is there to support. And we've really seen that you can have success with that. It might not be in 1 year, it might be in 5 or 8 years. But there's really that's one of the things that I think is really positive.
David, it's interesting. So I took this role as the global CEO of Hudson RPO just over a year ago. And one of the things that caught me and one of the things I'm instilling here is developing your 2IC or your second in command, right?
Mm.
And I actually talked to my leadership team about, your job is to make yourself redundant almost, right? And what does that mean? That doesn't mean that you're going to be out of a job here at Hudson. That's just going to mean that you're going to be able to take on more opportunities as we continue to grow as a firm globally and offer new product lines, right? And that development is definitely critical, but it's getting into that new way of thinking or a different way of thinking of true leadership and that succession planning. But I also want to pivot a little bit to talk about, where do you think that we're going now with all of these stats, the stats on the C-suite stats, the survey from Gartner, right? The idea of the Great Hesitation kind of softening and maybe there's a return to normalcy. What would you advise, right? The listeners and those TA experts to do and prepare for right now. What are some of those key learnings that you've did it when you had to tackle some pretty tough situations in your previous roles?
Well, I guess let's hit that return to normalcy, right? And what is normalcy, right? We've kind of been using that term since 2021, the new normal, but I don't think we ever landed in new normal. I don't think we've landed in new normal yet. Um, uh, but if we look back to kind of 2022, 2023, and I think that's when we've entered this kind of dip stage. Um, uh, and I think HR budgets have been cut across the board, and TA is often, the hardest cut, particularly when we're in, a dip. Um, uh, and I think investments are down in terms of people and resource, but also in terms of tech and process development, and also in terms of brand. Um, uh, and I think people really need to get ahead of those, all three of those areas. But probably the most important, if you had to put them in order, it's the people and the resource and actually the brand. Because if they don't get ahead of that, then I fear that normalcy will be back to what happened in 2021, which is when our recruiters were just overburdened. and on risk of exit from the market due to burnout. So I think it's really important that people get ahead of that and prepare for that.
You know, it's interesting, David, on the brand piece. I was talking with a CHRO as of yesterday, and we were talking about brand, and we were talking about, all of the macroeconomics and geopolitical items that are facing them right now. You have the pendulum swaying a little bit on the DE and IMB strategy, right? You have the return to work strategy and a return to office strategy. And we actually got on the topic of return to office and about how does that impact your brand and your culture. But also what I shared and what I'm hearing about is it's impacting that, but it's also impacting your talent pool, right? Because during the Great Resignation, the work from home, it literally expanded exponentially the talent pool because you can have a technology specialist, work for a company in Rhode Island that sits in San Diego, right? And they don't have to come to the office. Now, with companies, requiring the, 3 to 4, 5 days return to office, you're shrinking your talent pool potentially, and that impacts not only your culture, your brand, but also the available, talent and be able to support the business needs. And I think that some of those aspects are not really, thought about, and that puts more pressure on the talent leaders to be able to say, why come work for us here? Why is it now that we want you in the office 3 to 4 or 5 days a week, and what does that mean? What have you seen in that regards, and how do you feel about that coming, leading big organizations from both sides of that spectrum?
So I agree with you entirely. And firstly, if we look back at that point of the brand, right, I think the challenge is that the brands have been underinvested since some of these changes. And so people won't realize that when they go to maybe blow the dust off some of the stuff, if it hasn't been invested in, it's not current anymore, right? And it's not current to this part of the market. Um, uh, and as you say, this remote work, actually, I read an article in The Economist, recently, and the headline, was something like remote work is a perk, so expect a pay cut. But of course, that was to draw attention, right? You read the article, and it was clear they didn't agree with that. And actually, the evidence, was stating that the companies that are treating flexibility as a competitive advantage are the ones that are doing better at attracting top talent. Um, uh, and I think for me, what I'm looking at, and worried about is that we're in a candidate-rich market, and we have been for the last 18 months, right? Um, uh, and sure, there are some organizations that will always have an A1 brand, right? Google's, Facebook's, etc. And they will be able to get away with what they want to get away with. Those of us that aren't in that situation, um, uh, they may have been successfully holding on to a position during a candidate rich market, but when they enter a candidate short market, then I think things are going to change, and they're going to realize that their position is not competitive, and like you say, it's just not going to attract the top talent. It reminds me of a rather interesting topic at HRLT level pre the pandemic, actually, when we were looking in a new office, a new location, of an office policy that was really mandating quite a heavy presence in the office. And in one part of our business that was growing, very rapidly at the time, the term that was coined was talent repellent. And I think, I've never forgotten that term, right? It was quite new, but now we're really seeing this. And a lot of these policies, they risk being talent repellents for some organizations, which would be a shame because otherwise they've got a great EVP.
Yeah, and it brings up a good point too, right? Is highlight those things that make your company great, right? And the other thing is, those things that do not, like the talent repellents that you're talking about, don't ignore them, right? But bring them forefront. Let the individual know, because guess what? The worst thing you can do is have a bad hire, go through the process, right? Select the candidate, and in 6 months or 9 months, that candidate leaves because it wasn't developed, it wasn't cracked up to what they were told, and that is almost worse than hiring the number two candidate in that mix, right? And I think that all of these factors are facing us today. Let me ask you this, David. I'm going to keep us on time here too, and this is a great conversation. But as a TA leader, right, as somebody that has gone through the thick of things and mass hiring and downturns and everything else, what's keeping you up at night right now?
No, that's a good ask. Um, uh, so as you know, Jake, I've been out of the market for a wee while. I've taken a sabbatical. So, but as I'm looking to kind of go back in, um, uh, I guess I don't know where I'm going to land. But what's keeping me up and what the kind of challenges? I think first off at the more at the macro level, is experience. All right. I think experience is key, and I like to really think of the experience in three pillars, but interconnected. So can I think of that standard, three circle diagram, right? And the sweet
Yeah.
spot in the middle. And the three areas for me is employee, which is candidate as well as employee. So as they shift in, that's one cohort. The other is the manager or leadership inside of the organization. And the other is the recruiter, right? Or if we're talking about another area of the workforce life cycle, it can be anywhere. It could be the payroll specialist or whatever. Um, uh, but I think there's been such monumental changes in terms of tech coming through process. I worry though that people are not really looking at the experience, as they're seeing tech. And
Mhm.
I guess I'm seeing some of that on the other side, right? And I'm also, in networking groups, where frankly some of the experiences that people are sharing, is really concerning. So it's given me a real focus. Um, uh, but then the other thing that's going on that really is concerning me um, uh, is the EU pay transparency, right? I think it will be interesting for organizations to know who inside is really understanding what's coming and how they're going to uphold this. How is the interconnectivity already in terms of job architecture and job profiles, for the flow of information, um, uh, as well as how is the training? Some states in the US are further ahead, so that's great. Some of the larger organizations will have had training, but how are we preparing recruiters, for the conversations that they have to have with managers when we move towards that public salary postings. I think it's a great thing, but it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, David, no, you're absolutely right. And I would say, just to add on to that, one thing that, keeps me up at night being the provider, right? Being in the other seat is how can I continue to drive agility and scalability for our partners, right? And, there's a laundry list of, headwinds that face us. There's a lot of tailwinds with the new streams of digital and technology. But what I always say is that we are in the business of people, right? We don't make cogs. We don't make drugs. Our product is finding our partners the best talent that's out there at the best rate and to make sure that they hit the company's objectives, right? And so agility, scalability, the geographical landscape that continues to happen, the talent intelligence or the insights that our teams need to bring, as well as the digital aspect. There's a whole host of things and topics that we've covered here today, but I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being the part of the first talent talk. Everybody, my name is Jacob Zabkowicz. I'm the global CEO at Hudson RPO. This is David Priestley. David is, again, a key partner, a dear friend. We've tackled a lot of talent issues in the past. As David mentioned, he is in the market. I wouldn't put a plug out for him, but he is in the market. So if you have any desires to hire a great talent leader, please look David Priestley up. We will be sharing his contact information along with his podcast. And until next time, next month, we will come up with a new podcast and be sharing this with the group. So, David, again, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. Greatly appreciate your insights, and we'll be talking soon.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Good to be with you.
Take care.